the EU very much had sort of social democracy in its DNA, and it kind of made me realise that I didn't agree with that. That actually I had come to be a much stronger free marketeer than I realised. We need to get taxation and spending down. We need to remarketise parts of the economy. We need to make markets work better. Then we will find some of these problems resolving themselves. We will reach a point, I'm afraid, where these things are the obvious solution to our problems once again. And when it is, we need to have the material ready.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the IEA podcast. My name is Reem, Ibrahim, and I'm the Head of Media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by the Right Honourable Lord David Frost, who is also the incoming Director General and Ralph Harris Fellow here at the IEA. Congratulations on the new appointment, David. We're very excited to have you join us.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here, really looking forward to it and getting going. There's so much to do here.
There is so much to do, especially with the free market movement in the state that the country is and the way that we are going at the moment. So let's first of all talk a bit about who you are. Sure. So you obviously have worked as a civil servant, you've worked at the sort of corridors of power in government. Tell us about your own political journey, which is a bit of an unusual one, at least in comparison to other journeys.
Yeah, it is. And of course, I got into politics late in the first place. So in a way, a lot of this has been sort of concealed from public view, and rightly so. If you're a civil servant, your own politics are irrelevant to what you're trying to do. But when I was a student, I was in the Labour Party. I had, I guess, sort of fairly conventional sort of leftist views about things till, I suppose, my mid-20s. And in the usual way, maybe this doesn't seem to be happening quite so much nowadays, but at the time, in the usual way, some of this was knocked out by real life. And I think a great moment for me really was my first year or two in Brussels, which was the early 90s, when that really sort of made my kind of intellectual change of heart kind of visible to myself, I suppose, but not only in, the familiar debates about, the superstates and EU powers and all of that, but, what I came to think was that the EU very much had sort of social democracy in its DNA, and it kind of made me realize that I didn't agree with that actually I had come to be a much stronger free marketeer than I realized. And that's really the kind of intellectual journey I've taken since then. And that's kind of where I've ended up.
And working in Brussels with sort of negotiations and the conversations that you were having specifically with European partners, of course, a lot of that is to do with economic liberty and the trading relationship that the United Kingdom was going to have with Europe in the future. But in the 1990s, what that looked like was ever so slightly different. The European Union was a different state than what it was or what it is now and what it was like when we left the EU. Could you explain what that looked like for you and how you sort of went from that kind of line of work where you are politically neutral to then entering political life?
Yeah, so what I was seeing then was, I was responsible for kind of budget and economic stuff in our mission at the time. And what I was seeing was this kind of tremendous drive to centralisation in a way that wasn't sort of necessarily very well thought out. I saw a lot of the genesis of the single currency and the arguments around that, and the whole kind of optimum currency area arguments that were very live at the time. And it just seemed to me that this project was a kind of political one, and the economics were not being thought about. And I'm afraid that's a bit what we've seen. We've seen it at the EU level, and we've seen it at national level here in the UK. The politics overwhelms economics and rational decision-making all too often nowadays, and we need to recreate some space for the market to work.
Absolutely. That's music to all of our ears, I think. I think it's interesting when we're thinking about the way that the government often, or politicians at least, often want to do the right thing and often say that they are convinced free marketeers. And then when politics does get in the way, there are special interest groups that want special things, and therefore their free market principles, if they had any in the first place, tend to be done away with. So how did you actually enter political life, and how did you end up in the House of Lords?
So I decided when I was about 50 that I kind of had enough of being a civil servant and being a diplomat. You kind of have to live life on other people's terms, I guess, when you're a diplomat. And in the end, I got tired of that. So I went and ran the Trade Association, Scotch Whisky Association for a bit. And I guess
Why Scotch whisky?
so everyone sort of thinks of it as a sort of drinking club or whatever, but actually it's a big trade association. It had a lot of trade expertise in the WTO single market, a lot of kind of international legal enforcement, that sort of thing. Plenty of people there who could easily have held down a job at the WTO or the Commission in these areas. And so, although in one way it seems sort of anomalous, actually, it's our biggest single exported product, and knowledge of the WTO and trade promotion was important. So, for me, it was quite revealing to see a lot of this stuff from the other side. And I think one of the things I took from it is the stuff that's high status in government, like talking about, grand trade agreements, grand patterns, treaties, and so on, is kind of interesting, but not that useful in the short run to people who are actually trying to sell their products. What they want is market barriers to be brought down straight away, and they're less worried about the big picture. So seeing things from that point of view was really interesting and important.
And how long were you at the Scotch Whisky Association?
So I was there for 3 years, and then the Brexit vote happened. I was there through it, and then Boris. I didn't know Boris at the time, but various people who knew both of us said, "Why don't you come in and be a special advisor? Boris doesn't know the Foreign Office particularly well. You do. You sympathise with his views. Why don't you come in and help?" So that's how it happened. And I was 2 years special advisor. That's a political sort of civil servant. Then he resigned, and when he came back as prime minister, I came back as chief negotiator, and ended up in the Lords and a minister. So that's how it all happened. Random chance.
So very random, but I suppose not the conventional way into politics.
No.
What was it like during the Brexit years, and what was it like serving in Boris Johnson's government, and sort of your own free market principles, and what that may have looked like as somebody that was sort of constrained by the political will of that time of day, or what things looked like during that period of time?
Yeah, I think first thing to say perhaps is that anyone who says that the Brexit decision and the arguments around it was a kind of obvious decision is fooling themselves. I think they're wrong. There are arguments in all sorts of directions around whether you should be in the EU or not, and a lot of that comes from your own kind of personal worldview as much as anything about economics. Really, what we have done is moved from kind of one set of trade-offs, I suppose, as part of the EU to another set of trade-offs as an largely independent nation state. And I do think my own view is that there are many intermediate steps or places between those two things for a country like the UK. Either you have national control and the right to set your own rules and you have one set of trade-offs, or you are part of a bigger unit in which you have some say, but you don't have control, and there are other set of trade-offs. And I certainly took the view, Boris took the view, many of us took the view that the kind of intermediate step where you had to accept other people's rules about how you ran your economy without any say in them would in the end not work for the UK. And I think the frustration we had for a lot of that time, certainly under the Theresa May period, was the sort of refusal to make choices about things and to try and have it all ways and pretend that these trade-offs didn't exist and everybody could be kept happy. And they just couldn't. And of course, that's what drove the May government into chaos and collapse in the end. So we took the view that the important thing was to get the nation state working again and to get a free trade agreement, and in my view to be as open to the rest of the world as we possibly can, and that's what we tried to deliver.
So Brexit for you was about making Britain freer and not more enclosed.
That's right. For me, it comes back to the point I was making earlier about the EU being a sort of social democratic controlling organization. It may not have started off like that when the first ideas of the single market were created in the 70s and 80s, but it had become an organization that was not particularly liberalizing, was more kind of one size fits all homogenizing about the way Europe did economic policy. And what I wanted to see was Britain, being able to get back to a smaller state, freer markets, more open to the rest of the world, not as caught up in all of this. And of course, it hasn't entirely worked out like that, but we still can do this if we wish to.
Yeah, I mean, these are the trade-offs, right? Because it's either Britain fights for freer markets and free trade within the European Union, and I think many of our European partners would probably argue that the UK's membership of the EU meant that there was a more free market voice, at least in comparison to other European nations, in the EU. Or it is that we fight with Westminster and Whitehall and our own national government for more freedom. And I think that, well, it would be interesting to hear what you think about things post-Brexit, but do you think that Britain is freer after we've left the European Union?
Well,
We have the potential to be.
with the potential to be, I'm afraid, in some ways we look more European after leaving than we did before. And I think there are probably some quite deep-rooted reasons for that. I don't think we are freer. I mean, it's obviously not cause and effect with Brexit. I think we're all caught up, us Europeans, many economies around the world, we're just caught up in this terrible collectivism of thinking the state has to be involved in everything. And of course, and there's this also trend towards kind of control ID, certification in terms of like personal freedom and so on. There's also a very marked trend which kind of troubles me a lot. So these big global trends are unfortunately what's shaping the intellectual climate. And we've had politicians who've largely, not entirely, but largely kind of just gone along with that. And that's why tax and spend regulation, everything has continued to get worse.
And it certainly has gotten worse. I mean, now we're at public spending as a proportion of GDP is about 44%. I mean, literally half the economy is the government.
Right, so who knows where it's going to be in another 3 weeks' time.
Well, indeed. Oh God, the incoming budget. I think is something we're all anxious about. Perhaps I can claim PIP for my anxiety over the budget. Right. So during the Brexit years, you were sort of that voice within government and your relationship with the Prime Minister. So I grew up in Boris Johnson's former constituency in Oxford.
Okay, right.
So I think it was, it's interesting seeing the journey of the Conservative Party specifically. Now, during this period of time, you were obviously serving in government and the size of the government was getting bigger. Arguably, Britain was getting less and less free, or at least the burden of the state was becoming less and less easy to handle for British taxpayers.
Yeah.
What was that like during that period of time, and how do you think you reconciled being a free marketeer within government and serving under a government that was ultimately damaging the economy?
Yeah, I'm not, obviously I was only a minister for a year or so. Before that I was an advisor, albeit a slightly unusual one. But I do think that one can't be naive about these things. Nobody in government gets everything they want. You have to ask yourself the question, are you doing more good than not by staying? And certainly for most of the Brexit period, 2019, 2020, bit of 21, my focus was entirely on, trying to bring this kind of long national agony to an end and getting us out on acceptable terms and helping the country move on. And that's what we did. And then in 2021, obviously, we were out of the transition period. We also had this ghastly pandemic with the handling of it around us. And what I was seeing was, I think, two things. One, that my hopes to kind of get onto a free market path were not really being borne out, and the government was ruling out large areas of regulation as kind of non-touchable in terms of EU, of trying to sort of strip away EU law. I mean, net zero being the obvious one, where we were simply not allowed to question the endless kind of super regulation and control that kind of came with the way we were going to do it. But there are others. So and a bit of a moment for me was on customs, which in a kind of small point, but it was one that went to the PM and to the Chancellor. We talked about it, which was, should we implement the same controls on inward movements of goods as the EU had, our old customs border? So, and it's been a kind of a problem consistently since then. Should we try to have the same high level of paperwork and controls on inward goods that the EU insisted on ours? And my view was, no, we shouldn't. There's no point. It's kind of disguised tariff. We should just let goods, more or less, from countries that we believed had reputable kind of processors to come in. That was a kind of comparative advantage for us. But the PM and the Chancellor said, no, we have to have we have to do it the same way as part of being a kind of serious country. We just have to do it. And to me, that was a moment like, if we can't change something that's like so closely linked to the EU's rationale, the actual terms of trade, the actual processes that we thought we got out of, if we couldn't change that, then maybe we're not going to change anything much. And I think that was part of it. So I could see this kind of drift. And in my eventual letter of resignation, I can't remember the precise form of words, but it was about uncomfortable with the direction of travel of the government. What drove me out in the end was certification, vaccine passporting, all that sort of thing, which was being implemented for the first time. So it seemed to me like the instincts were not particularly deregulatory. They weren't to take on the arguments. And this feeling that we'd kind of worked so hard to get out of the EU that we could just sit back in the armchair. And actually, leaving the EU was just a gate we had to go through. The garden still had to be made and cultivated, and we just weren't doing any of that.
That's a fantastic analogy. I love that. Interesting. I think it's the wider perspective on Brexit, whether or not it is the case that the national government in the United Kingdom was easy to put pressure on to be pro-market than it was to try and put pressure on the European Union to be more pro-market. And I think that was sort of the dividing line. But almost certainly it was the case that those that were at the top of the Vote Leave campaign were of the free market persuasion.
Yes.
The
Absolutely.
coalition of voters that supported us exiting the European Union at the referendum perhaps were not all convinced free marketers. And actually a lot of the arguments were being made on things like immigration and Turkey being part of the EU and whether or not we're going to have an influx of Turkish migrants. A lot of it was on things that were not necessarily naturally of the free market persuasion. But perhaps that's just politics.
No, I think you're right. And the referendum went the way it did because of something unusual in Britain, which is that kind of the free market, the kind of 10 or 15% of opinion, and the people who lead that, who are kind of genuine, sort of convinced free marketeer, small state people, went with Brexit rather than with Remain. And in Europe, in the rest of the EU, that sort of segment of opinion tends to be pro-EU. It sees the Commission as a sort of liberalising force. And in Britain, by and large, not entirely, obviously, but to quite a large extent, it went the other way. And that wing of the Conservative Party went the other way in this vote. And that was enough to get it kind of over the line. And I think that's unusual, and you don't necessarily get that in other EU member states. So, yeah, there was a lot going on in the referendum, obviously, but the polling after it says that the main reason people voted to leave was because they wanted decisions about Britain to be taken in Britain.
Is that
That's
That's
fundamental.
Yeah. Before we get to the post lockdown period, your resignation, and this was in 2021, is that right?
That's right,
And
to the end.
what was the sort of the key motivation behind eventually deciding this isn't going to be for me? I don't want to be part of this government anymore.
So the proximate cause, and the thing that kind of probably forced me out when other things might not have, was the further lockdown in 2021 that was coming, and specifically the government's decision to implement vaccine passporting certification for access,
Were
which
you
we've
supportive
never
of the first lockdown?
done before. Well, I understand why it was done. And, I remember the chaos in government in March and April 2020. The government essentially collapsed to all intents and purposes. Downing Street was largely empty. Nobody knew quite what was happening. There was all this sort of alarmist stuff. I understand why it was done. And to me, the error was like the failure to assimilate new information and correct. And you see this in all sorts of areas in government. It's the sort of kind of instinct to kind of double down and not admit mistakes and kind of carry on, rather than say, okay, we got that wrong, we won't do it again.
But morally, do you think the government ever should have the right to tell you that you can't leave your home?
I mean, we're all uncomfortable with it. I don't really like it. I understand why it was done. If in those first few weeks, I certainly don't think it should have been done after that, when we knew what we were dealing with, and we now know that it was probably unnecessary even then.
Yeah. We had a 3.2% difference in mortality rates between the United Kingdom and Sweden. Sweden, of course, did not lock down at all.
No.
So I think it's definitely interesting when we're taking things away from our sort of the first principled basis, which is, if we believe in a smaller government. I mean, from my perspective is the government never had the right to lock down the country, and the moral panic, the government was sort of co-opted by moral panic. Those of us that were opposed to lockdowns were seen as sort of conspiracy theorists, and actually sort of a lot of suppression of sort of freedom of expression during that period of time, and indeed afterwards. Let's talk about the post-pandemic period. So you're in the House of Lords, and these conversations within the party specifically over the last few years, I think what's been interesting is you have been a very vehement sort of free market liberal in that respect, and you have been a very important voice over the last few years, especially when it comes to things like free speech, but also on free trade, on the government staying out of the way more principally. What did that look like for your intellectual journey? I mean, you were sort of in some ways liberated from the shackles of government.
Yeah.
So you were sort of had a bit more freedom to have those conversations. What did that look like for you?
So I mean, I did feel liberated to say things, and of course, things were going from bad to worse, and have been for a couple of decades probably now. If you look back at the early Blair years, for example, public spending was like 10 points. Tax and spend was 10 points lower than what it is now. The arguments were just as important then, but they're even more live now, because every current opinion has gone the other way since then. Every economic trend has gone the other way since then. And so therefore it just seemed like urgent to try and put something out in the public debate that tried to make a counter case from first principles. And we had this government doing all sorts of terrible, stupid stuff. I mean, the previous government, the Conservative government, the renters reform thing, the football regulator, the tobacco ban, all this sort of stuff. An endless wave of terrible regulatory ideas, and doing nothing to get tax down. In fact, pushing it up, apart from the sort of mad rush right at the end of government. And it just seemed that we'd completely lost confidence in the free market principles that the Conservative Party was supposed to stand for. We might occasionally talk about them, but we no longer believed in our actions that people could get along without the state, and markets could, to a very large extent, kind of regulate themselves. And we've drifted into this sense of the world where nothing can happen without the government. It's
Yeah.
sunk right into everybody. So it is now really countercultural to think the government doesn't need to be involved in this. We can just let it happen and see what happens. And that will probably be the best outcome.
And I think as a politician, that's a very difficult answer to have. I mean, if you're sort of on a breakfast show in the UK and being asked as a minister, what are you going to do about this problem? And if your answer is, well, nothing, I don't believe it's the role of the government to be involved. I don't think it's a particularly conducive answer to political popularity.
No, but you have to be able to say that.
Yeah.
I do remember Lady Thatcher saying things like that.
It's not the role of government.
There are limits to what government can do. People have got to be able to run their own lives. And you just don't hear people saying this much anymore.
Exactly. No, I think that's true. I think you're right in that there's sort of been a cultural shift towards wanting more government. And I think that shift really occurred properly after the pandemic, because we've got a whole generation of younger people that simply do not know how to live their lives without the government telling them how to. And I think that was sort of a post-lockdown shift.
I think so, though. I do think it was brewing. It's been brewing since the financial crash, I think, and the bailouts. And I actually think a lot of net zero and the sort of lifestyle politics that Chris Snowdon talks about has been a big part of this, because it's kind of politicized everyday life. Every choice you make, where you put your rubbish, where you go on holiday, what planes you take, what car you drive, all this sort of thing has become politicized in a way that it just wasn't 30 years ago. And it's contributed to this sense that the state's kind of closing in on you and nothing you can do. You can only act if your actions are basically kind of in accordance with the governing philosophy of the state. And if your beliefs aren't, in the end, you're going to run up against a problem. And that's what's got embedded, I think, over these couple of decades.
And in January 2026, you will be heading up the IEA as our Director General and Ralph Harris Fellow.
Yeah.
Why did you want to make the shift from being directly in political life to now heading up the battle of ideas for the free market? And as a sub-question to that, what is the free market in your view?
Gosh, so the answer to your first question is just that I think the battle of ideas is the important thing at the moment. Obviously, on the right, though, it's important not to forget that there is a kind of market strand on the left. Is very suppressed at the moment, but it does exist, and one shouldn't forget it. But broadly, obviously, on the right, there is this kind of tactical war going on between the tourism reform, who, fundamentally, I think, have voters who think very similar things, but are divided. And that tactical war is not particularly conducive to kind of having free debate about things, because everything's kind of caught up in that. So that's why I think stepping back from that and just kind of getting out of it for a bit and coming to an organization like the IEA that fundamentally is about ideas and the battle of ideas and winning that argument is the urgent thing to do. We'll never get the country in the right place, whether it's Reform, Conservative, Coalition, whatever. It'll never be in the right place unless they're operating against a background of fundamental understanding of the ideas of freedom and of free markets and of the ability of society to kind of self-organize without the state being involved all the time. And that's the argument that needs to be won. And I think the IEA is a great place, one of the best places to do it from. So that's fundamentally why.
I'm inclined to agree with you, David. What is the free market in your view? What is the limit of, where are the limits of the state in your view? And I'm not saying what they are now, what they ought to be. What do you think the government should be involved in, and what do you think the government should not be involved in?
So I think it's difficult to say kind of ex ante. I think what one can say is that they're involved in too many things at the moment. If we had public spending at, say, 20% of GDP in this kind of fantasy world where it's never been since, the 1920s or whatever, at that point, you could perhaps be having an argument about, okay, does the marginal pound through public spending make a difference? That's not the urgent problem at the moment. The urgent problem is to get the state out of doing lots and lots of things that it does at the moment, doesn't have to. So, we do not need a publicly run NHS in the form that we've got it. The state has got to get out of regulating so many markets of all kinds. I mean, obviously we need planning reform, but there's the state's reach into regulating so much of private industry now, sort of semi taking it over almost in many ways. That's all got to be reversed. We obviously need to find a way of putting the pensions, public sector pensions, onto a sustainable basis. We destroyed a perfectly good system in the late 90s under Gordon Brown, and now we're paying the price for that. So
I don't think people really realise how enormous the government's liabilities really are.
No.
And, I think that this is interesting because the politically difficult thing to do is talk about things like public sector pensions, because of course the civil service you want, generally speaking, on your side, but also more crucially for Conservatives, talking about things like the National Health Service, the state pension, the fact that public spending is so out of control, but actually for a lot of the time for very industries or very areas of the economy that the Conservative Party at the very least wanted to vote for them.
Yes.
Where do you square that circle? Would you abolish the triple lock on pensions? Would you say we should have a social health insurance model instead of the NHS? Where do you draw that distinction?
So I mean, to take those two examples, I definitely think we need a social insurance model for the NHS. I mean, the current model is obviously broken, damaging, expensive, all of those things. The triple lock, I think, does need to go. It's a policy that just drives up pensions as a share of spending, and we have to find a kind of fair and sustainable way of unwinding it all and putting it on a better basis. And it can't be simply that pensions go up and up and up as a share of GDP all the time. So that's my answer on those two questions.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's interesting because the sort of a lot of people will talk about how high taxes are and how public spending is far too high. That if you're just talking about Quangos and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which I believe all should go, I would completely abolish that department. Completely useless. When you are talking about public spending and actually bringing it down, those things are really just drops in the bucket, really, aren't they?
That's right.
The fundamental problem is age-related public spending increases, namely with health and with the state pension, and public sector pensions are going to really bite us over the next few years. But currently, when you look at what the government spends money on, I mean, this is where it is, right? And also almost 10% on debt interest payments. We're borrowing more to be able to pay the debt interest, but which is completely unsustainable. But that political problem is very difficult for many people in the Conservative Party, or at least on the right.
There's a complete failure to face up to the scale of the problem.
Be honest.
And, I don't wish to be particularly critical of what the Conservative Party said at the party conference, or rather to kind of single it out, because I think it's a kind of example rather than something standing on its own. But these 47 billion spendings that were announced, I mean, it's nothing.
Really?
It's it's a year of the kind of savings that we need to make. The vast amounts of public spending go on the NHS, on pensions and on welfare, and unless you're willing to tackle those things, then you're not going to achieve any significant public spending savings, particularly given the reality we're probably going to have to spend more on defence, and debt interest is kind of out of our control. In the short run, you have to attack those three areas. And actually I personally think that enough people in this country kind of understand that things are going wrong. And there is a market for people who are willing to be honest and say, this is what it's going to take. Because if we don't do these things, it'll only get even worse. Therefore, we have to tackle them now.
Let's talk about some of the other issues that I think are difficult in comparison to sort of the ideological battle between conservatives and libertarians and classical liberals. But my first question is, how would you describe your own political views or economic views or your views on the government? Are you a libertarian? Are you a classical liberal? Are you a conservative? Who are you?
I mean, these terms are so
boxed in.
Yeah, they've become like they mean slightly different things to different people now, and are possibly not that useful. I think I would say, in economic terms, I'd probably regard myself as a kind of Austrian Hayekian in the way I see the economy working. Probably that seems to me like the most powerful explanatory sort of framework of thinking for how the economy works.
What about Hayek specifically do you think explains what the market is?
The dispersed knowledge in the market. I wish I could get people to read The Use of Knowledge in Society again. It's simply, the insight simply isn't understood, and the failure to understand it is behind all this government knows best, both in social regulation, also sort of industrial policy. We know what the industries of the next 30 years are going to be, view that you get. It's simply a category error, a heresy, to think that people on the right can somehow run an economy better than people on the left because they sort of know better and have the right ideas. You have to let go and let it organize itself. That's the thing we have from time to time believed and no longer believe. That's the fundamental thing that I think needs to happen in the economic sphere. So just rely on the market much, much more, free it up, let people stop obsessing about market failure and start worrying about government failure a lot more, and just pull back, reverse a lot of what's been done in recent years and create a space where people can kind of run their own lives and run their own businesses, develop themselves as people as they wish. Just get out and let people do it. That's what I think needs to be done. So if that makes me a libertarian, yes, then it's pulling back, it's recreating civil society, free from the dead hand of government the whole time.
I think that's a very, very eloquent answer, especially when we're thinking about the Hayekian knowledge problem. I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think Hayek's best idea was the knowledge problem because it explains so much about why fundamentally the government cannot ever obtain the knowledge required to centrally plan an economy.
That's right.
That knowledge is dispersed amongst millions of people across an economy, and it can never be obtained. Even if it was obtained, it would change within the hour.
That's right.
So that knowledge is entirely within the millions of people that work hard and contribute and exchange within the economy.
But we're going to face it again, I think, just to pause on that, because you do hear people saying, it's merely a sort of technology failure, that with AI, soon we are going to be able to master these things.
Acemoglu, I think, said this.
And I just think it's a kind of, the argument defeats itself. The knowledge is tacit. The knowledge can't all be crystallized in that way. It's simply a category error to think it can be boiled down in that way.
It's also why prices are so important, because prices communicate that information to consumers, and any kind of meddling in prices is so economically damaging because you are effectively sort of trying to get involved in something that is completely natural. I mean, the way a price is, sort of the final price that you see as a consumer is contributed to by so many different factors, whether it be supply chains or the potential market return for a specific product, whatever it is. There are, we literally can never possibly know, and we just sort of could never obtain the knowledge even within that person. Many consumers probably aren't even aware of the knowledge that is required to
No,
do that. They don't know why they buy a certain product or what the reasons were, whether it be convenience or time, or they saw a particular advert. Whatever it is, that knowledge is completely dispersed.
that's right. The signaling function of prices is not understood, I think, generally, and you don't hear people kind of talking about it or explaining it. But it is obviously really important, and unfortunately, we have drifted into a sort of a degree of price control in some areas, and an obsession with kind of distributional questions in the economy that takes us down the road to being a managed economy. And the Conservative Party did that with his energy price cap and so on and so forth. The attempt to manipulate prices of cars and boilers and all sorts of other things. It's only going one way at the moment, and it needs to stop.
It is. There are other aspects of this that I think we sort of see contentions between, within the right, and these are sort of the debates that are currently happening. That's on trade and on immigration. So with trade, I think it's fascinating. Reform obviously have said they want to nationalise the steel industry. You've got the Conservative Party who also said similar sort of sentiments when they were in government, and it seems as though there is a consensus that the sort of threat of China or the threat of potential foreign adversaries is higher than the value of free trade. What's your view on this debate?
I mean, I don't think there's a single correct answer to it.
Would you nationalise steel?
No, I wouldn't. I think that the problem is kind of is much more deep rooted than that. That's the problem. We're asking people to recognize that we're asking people to operate a steel industry, an economy that has hugely high energy prices, all sorts of kind of market controls on labor, location, ability to build, all kinds of things. The fundamental problems are those, not so much the short run problems of steel. Now, if you were a government that would say, right, for 10 years, we're going to unwind all this stuff, by the time we've done, it's going to be completely different. We are confident in those circumstances we need, that people want to have a steel industry in Britain. We want to keep the blast furnaces going. So, okay, we're going to maintain it while this is going on. The trouble is that you never get the while this is going on. You only just get the
Permanent.
the permanent sort of subsidy while everything else is going the other way. And that's why you can't really look at these questions in isolation. I do think that, I'm quite a purist on tariffs and so on. I wish we'd get rid of most of our tariffs to an extent that we haven't done so.
I think we should abolish all of them. I think we'd be richer tomorrow if we abolished every single tariff and quota.
We absolutely would. I do think there is a national security justification in principle. I think it's widely regarded probably as an error that we were trading to the extent that we were with, say, Nazi Germany before World War II. So I think there must be a point where you think, okay, that probably is not sensible. The question is, are we at that point with China, Russia, whoever? And I think that's difficult to tell. I think it's wise to be prudent with China. I don't know that tariffs are necessarily the best tool. They perhaps are in one or two areas. But I think it's so easy to let this national security justification spread. And, you get the French had their sort of famous national security justification for the yogurt industry of 20 years ago. And that's where you get to. I think probably I would if the equal and opposite risks of having no tariffs and seeing what happens and worrying endlessly about a sort of national security justification and control about certain things, I'd rather go with the first if you're forced to choose between two probably imperfect.
Okay. Immigration. It's obviously an issue that has co-opted huge levels of debate. Of course, we discussed this in the Brexit context, whether or not people were voting to leave the European Union just because they wanted this country to be in control of its own laws, or if it was actually the case that many of those people were voting for Brexit or a Conservative government, or indeed perhaps now a Reform government, for less immigration. Now, generally speaking, the free market argument would be that if we believe in free trade in capital and in land, we believe that all of the economic factors of production should be traded freely without the government's interference, then that would in theory also include labour markets. The free exchange of people, of labour between different countries is in many ways also inclusive in the free market argument. What do you think about that disparity in that particular debate?
So I wouldn't agree with it in its purest form as you've just described it.
Okay.
I think I would agree with it kind of up to a point. And the reason I say up to a point is that where to start? I'm a believer in the democratic nation state as the best way humanity has found of kind of organizing its political, economic, and social affairs. Ideally, not such a controlling one as the one we've got, but in principle, a kind of a sort of a nation that organizes affairs with a degree of sort of solidarity. Now, a nation is more than just the territory. It's a whole set of kind of cultural assumptions, affective beliefs, traditions, the way we do things here, kind of how we've solved problems in the past, assumptions about kind of how the world works and the way we live that are different in every single nation. And those are very important to kind of holding it together and providing the degree of security and solidarity you need to make markets work, the level of kind of trust, belief, willingness to kind of operate these extended networks the markets rely on depends on a degree of sort of belief and trust. Now, the risk is that if you have, as I see it, if you have sudden high levels of immigration, probably maybe from some parts of the world than others, you knock away at this belief in sort of solidarity and trust and the assumptions really quite quickly. And that's what I see happening in recent years in Britain, that when people lose confidence in the ability of the nation state and the national government to kind of hold the ring for all the debates, people want to identify with something, so they retreat to other identities, group rights, ethnic, religious, whatever. And that's what you see beginning to happen, I think, in a lot of Western countries. And I think in the end, that is bad for a liberal economy, for markets, for individual freedom as well. You start moving towards a kind of tribal view of the world. And I don't want that to happen. And so that's why I think one has to think about the absorptive capacities of humans, and to say that freedom of movement of labour is just the same as movement of goods, I don't entirely agree with, because people are people and they don't behave like you want them to. Just as we always say to the left, you have to think of the Laffer curve or whatever. You have people don't behave like you want them to. They stop doing things when you try and sort of make them act in certain ways by law. The behavioral effects are hard to predict. So they are in this area as well. People don't see themselves just as economic units. They see themselves as part of a broader society, and sustaining that kind of cohesion and belief and assumption that politics can be made to work for most people is really, really important. So that's why I think one has to be careful. The numbers that have come into the country in recent years, I think, are probably too high for that process to happen. You need to make sure it happens in a way that people can be comfortable with it. And I think that's just the reality of the way a nation works. I also, I'm kind of slightly unconvinced of, that all immigration is always good or always necessary for a free market economy. In the 80s, we had net emigration for most of the Thatcher era, and it didn't prevent, a massive amount of free market revival of the economy. So I think one just has to look at these things sort of slightly pragmatically. If we'd had immigration for, say, under 100,000 a year for these few years, I don't think anybody would be talking about it, and things would be going on perfectly well. In the end, it is a question of, can you maintain the cohesion and the networks of the society that we're in? And I think we're straining at that at the moment. That's not an economic issue. That's a broader social, cultural one.
I think the conversation should really be about why we have such high levels of immigration and why taxpayers are being forced to pay for it.
Totally.
So I do take the view that the free market also includes free labour markets, and we must be able to exchange. I don't believe the government should ever tell a business in the UK that they cannot hire somebody from abroad. But I think that's a very separate question to the situation we're in now. And I actually think the Americans had broadly got this right, because the US is a country built on immigration. There's people coming and working and contributing, and that is the American dream. And, sort of the more the merrier. Come and we'll grow the economy and you'll be economically successful. And my God, they're doing a much better job than we are, especially when it comes to GDP per capita. But in the UK, we have an enormous welfare state. We have the National Health Service, free education. We have a huge, huge, huge and bloated state. And so as people come to the United Kingdom, often they are being given huge amounts of taxpayer-funded benefits. And I think that does act as a magnet for high levels of immigration.
Yeah.
I mean, why would somebody decide, why would the boat people, why would somebody on a boat go from France to the United Kingdom? I think fundamentally, yes, there are the cultural aspects, yes, the English language, but I really do think economically they are better off because taxpayers are forced to foot the bill for it. So
Yeah.
I think that the question should really be about why are taxpayers being forced to foot the bill? Why are those people coming to the UK and are not net contributors? And I think that is an economic question.
Yeah,
We don't
I
have
agree.
a free labour market.
I agree. No, that's the problem. I mean, it's a bit like my analogy on the steel industry that you can't look at these things in isolation. The phenomenon that we see is actually the result of all sorts of other dysfunctions in the way things work, and you have to look kind of behind that initial phenomenon, see how we're going to solve the problem. We obviously have a system not only that attracts people to come here, but which allows lots of people to live without working here in the UK. And, that maybe the problem is we don't have enough carrot to get people back to work. Maybe the problem is we don't have enough stick to make it impossible for people to live like that. But we all know we have a lot of people who could be working who aren't working. Of course, if you can live without working on your own resources, that's one thing. To live without working at the expense of everybody else is something different.
Yeah.
And that's the problem we've got into. And that's so much the problem for an individual business. An individual business can't solve these societal problems. It just needs to find workers or go under, and that's why there's the pressure to look outside the UK. I completely understand that, and it's reasonable. But we must try, and it's the same answer for every question, really. We need to get taxation and spending down. We need to remarketize parts of the economy. We need to make markets work better. Then we will find some of these problems resolving themselves. And by the way, I think the kind of cultural conflict, for want of a better term, that we see is very much generated by being in a zero-sum economy with no growth, where you can only really kind of improve yourself at somebody else's expense all the time. It's bound to generate that sort of friction.
Yes, and I think, well, just on the immigration point, I think actually that integration occurs when people are in work, and when you have, I'm basically open borders if you can financially sustain yourself and your dependents. I do think you should be allowed to come to the UK and basically expect a huge amount of taxpayer-funded benefits, including free housing and driving lessons or God knows what.
But to say that point, I think, suppose we didn't have the demographic problem that we have. Suppose for whatever reason, women were still having 2.1 babies, and the demographic surge that we've seen in recent years was not being caused by immigration, but was just being caused by natural increase, as it has been in the past. We have seen this sort of thing in the past. You would still have a problem because in the way that we run the country, because we have such unresponsive public services. The thing that people often complain about with immigration is like there aren't enough schools, there aren't enough doctors, there aren't enough roads, all these sorts of things. There aren't enough houses. All those things would still be true.
But those are a government problem.
That's right.
Immigration problem.
That's right. All those things would still be true if the demographic surge was caused by more babies than by more migrants. You have to solve that problem. Nobody ever complains there aren't enough supermarkets. Everyone just expects, and they know Sainsbury's always will be there.
They'll respond to demand because they're in the market.
That's right, because they're in the market. You have to solve these. So again, it's the same answer. These hugely unresponsive public services are a big part of the problem here.
Okay. Just to finish up, we've spoken so much about your career and also your intellectual journey. I think it's really fascinating to really get into the detail of that. But more broadly, the free market movement is failing, obviously. The size of the state is getting much bigger. The extortionate levels of taxation year after year after year. We're going to see tax rises this year. We're going to see tax rises next year and the year after and the year after, until finally somebody says, okay, let's think about how we can actually reduce the size of the state. I think it's a comms problem. I think we don't communicate what capitalism or the free market actually means and how it benefits absolutely everybody in the country. How would you communicate freedom to Britain?
So I think, every organization that's interested in this area has got to, there are two things that you could do. One is like changing the climate of opinion by lots and lots of research in areas that need researching, sort of serious academic work. The IEA has done that in the past. The other is to kind of influence day to day and to try and persuade people kind of in the short run and win the immediate battle of ideas. Everyone's got to kind of place themselves somewhere on that spectrum and decide where you're going to be. Ideally, you do all those things, but probably that every organization's got to choose a bit. I tend to think that the level of dysfunction that we've got at the moment means that we probably have to move towards the first bit more, not necessarily as an organization, but as a movement, to explaining what is going wrong. That if you look too much at the sort of symptoms, you're failing to understand the causes, then you might win the odd sort of tactical victory, but you're not really winning the actual war of ideas. And probably that's what needs to be done. So, more the sort of thing that was done in the 70s of, really, and earlier actually here, trying to explain how markets could work better, getting politicians to pick it up. And, I think we have to be realistic that that's a long run battle given where we've got to. But it does need to be done, and we shouldn't be defeatist about it because it's been done before. It can be done again. We will reach a point, I'm afraid, where these things are the obvious solution to our problems once again. And when it is, we need to have the material ready. We have to have prepared the ground. People have to be kind of turning to free market solutions already worked out as the best way of putting things right again. So that's, I'm afraid, what I think needs doing is total picture, not just, I don't believe in sort of monocausal solutions to our problems. A lot of things going wrong. We know whether it's housing, energy, public services, whatever, all those things. We need to sort of explain how it all fits together and how it all needs to be unwound and work better again.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, David, for joining me today. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm very excited for you to be my new boss.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then do consider becoming an Insider subscriber at insider.iea.org.uk. And stay tuned for everything that the IEA is going to be doing over the next few years.